Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving straight into, well, some really contested territory. New York City. We're looking at this intense ideological clash happening right now over justice and public safety. Our sources, they paint a pretty dramatic picture. A city facing a real political moment.
Okay.
You know, for ages, NYC was the symbol of resilience, right? The city that always bounces back. But the narrative we're seeing in the material we reviewed, it's shifted a lot. There's this feeling reflected in our research that the city might be slipping into chaos. And that perception itself, well, whether it's totally fact-based or driven by fear, it's fueling huge political change.
Exactly. And that perception, that's really our mission for this deep dive. To get past the headlines, we want to unpack how that public anxiety, that raw feeling on the ground is colliding head-on with some pretty radical reform ideologies. We're looking right at this political crossroads where policies aimed at big systemic change are now being measured against the daily reality of keeping public order.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. What does this collision actually look like? When we talk about law enforcement and justice reforms, what are the specific friction points?
Well, the conversation pretty much immediately lands on two really big policy changes. First, there's the sweeping bail reform measure that was enacted. And second, the whole movement, or at least the conversation around defunding the police. And the irony here is quite something. These were hailed as progressive wins, right? Meant to tackle systemic inequality. But now, critics and even just worried residents are pointing fingers directly at these reforms, blaming them for what they see as the city's decline.
Okay, let's get specific, though. To understand why they're blamed, what actually happened with bail reform in New York State, based on what we've read?
So the core of it, this reform took effect in 2020. And what it did was eliminate cash bail for most misdemeanors and nonviolent felony arrests. The progressive thinking behind it was crucial. Stop the two-tiered system. You know, where if you had money, you walked free before trial, but if you were poor, you stayed locked up just because you couldn't afford bail.
Makes sense from an equity standpoint.
Yeah.
But what about the unintended consequences the critics are talking about? What are those?
Yeah, that's the crux of the criticism. Our sources really highlight this point. The change meant that individuals arrested for things like shoplifting, maybe certain types of assault, or even if they're repeat property offenders, they often had to be released. Almost immediately. In many cases, judges lost the discretion to hold someone based on, say, a perceived risk to public safety. Release became mandatory.
I see.
And critics argue that cycle arrest, immediate release, maybe another offense, is what's driving recidivism and contributing to this visible sense of, well, disorder on the streets.
Okay, that definitely makes the policy feel less like an abstract idea and more like something with immediate impact. Now, what about the other big flashpoint you mentioned? The push to defund the police. What did that actually look like in practice, especially in NYC?
Right. Defund the police. That phrase itself is obviously super true. But what our sources clarify happened in New York City wasn't like overnight abolition or anything. Instead, the city committed to a really significant budget cut for the NYPD, a massive $1 billion reduction.
Wow, $1 billion. That's substantial. Where did that money go? And what did it mean for the police department on a practical level?
Well, the plan was to reallocate those funds, mostly towards social services, things like mental health initiatives, community programs. It's that core progressive idea, right? Solve social issues with social resources, not just policing.
Okay.
But the critics, they argue the impact on law enforcement was immediate and pretty damaging, both to morale and just operational capacity. They point to specific things like dissolving certain plainclothes anti-crime units, cutting overtime, maybe training budgets. Basically, they argue the department was deliberately weakened, which, in their view, allowed certain types of crime to just kind of flourish.
So you've got this split. On one side, the intention is fairness, equity, shifting resources to help people. But on the other side, the perceived effect is disorder, maybe a sense of impunity for some crimes, and a police force with less power. This really does expose a fundamental difference in philosophy, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. When you trace these policy decisions back, you inevitably hit this deep philosophical divide. It's the engine driving the whole debate. It quickly stops being just about budget lines and bail rules, and it becomes about two fundamentally different visions for how a city should even work.
Which brings us right to the ideological storm powering this. The source material identifies this growing, really influential revolution perspective. It's being pushed by what they call ultra-progressive leaders. And one name comes up repeatedly, Assembly member Zohran Mamdani. He's advocating for really quite radical reforms. for listeners who might not be familiar, what does Mamdani's vision of radical reform actually involve, especially around policing and governance, the things critics are sounding the alarm about?
Yeah, this context is key. According to our sources, Mamdani and his allies aren't just tweaking the system. They're talking about sweeping, systemic change. This includes things like the complete decriminalization of poverty, dismantling what they see as an oppressive criminal justice system, and, yeah, ultimately the abolition of policing as we currently understand it. The idea is to replace it with community-led safety initiatives, universal housing programs, things like that. They see the entire structure, from housing courts to street patrols, as needing a total overhaul.
Well, abolition is a strong word.
It is. And for supporters, this isn't just policy, it's a moral fight. It's about justice, equality, and compassion. Their argument is that the system wasn't just a little flawed, it was fundamentally broken, maybe even racist, long before these recent changes. So they see themselves as trying to rebuild something centered on human dignity, not just punishment and control.
That's a powerful motivation. But it clashes dramatically with how critics see it. They look at those goals, police abolition, immediate release, and they frame it as a dangerous experiment, one they feel has already gone wrong, sacrificing immediate public safety for, well, maybe a utopian dream.
And the language used by critics gets really potent here. You see this ideological fear summed up, the idea that compassion without control inevitably leads to chaos. There's a specific, very strong conservative comment mentioned in our sources that kind of crystallizes this. Laura Ingraham's direct warning to New Yorkers. She told them to prepare for Mamdani-style punishment.
Mamdani-style punishment, that phrasing. It's pure political rhetoric, isn't it?
Yeah.
Designed to frame progressive policies themselves as the source of suffering. It's not just criticism, it's casting radical reform as something that doesn't bring fairness, but actually brings widespread disorder that hurts everyone.
Exactly. It forces this binary choice onto the public.
Yeah.
You can have order and security, or you can have radical change and uncertainty. Pick one. The debate kind of loses nuance and becomes this battle over who defines the city's future. Is it the reformers fighting for fairness, or the critics demanding immediate security?
It really highlights the ideological stakes, doesn't it? The question isn't just if reform is needed, but maybe how much, how fast. Has this push for progressive change in the eyes of critics crossed a line? From necessary correction to something that's actually destabilizing the city in a dangerous way. Okay, now let's bring this high-level ideological battle back down to earth, back to the people living in the city. We're talking about ordinary New Yorkers, right? The small business owner dealing with constant shoplifting, the single parent on the late-night subway, the worker just trying to get home safe after a late shift.
Precisely. Their day-to-day reality, according to the sources, is marked by this growing sense of uncertainty. It's profound for many. These folks, they're not necessarily debating legislative theory or ideological purity. They feel caught in the middle. They see data or maybe just feel the effects of certain crimes rising, while also hearing political promises that might feel increasingly, well, disconnected from their reality. Like maybe major felony stats go up and down, but it's the rise in what people call quality of life crimes, petty theft, visible disorder, maybe open drug use, that creates that feeling of a city spiraling. Our sources suggest that for the average commuter or the person running a small shop, that perceived decline in just everyday order, it feels just as damaging as a scary headline about a major crime statistic.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you zoom out this tension, it really shows how incredibly difficult it is to govern a huge city like New York. How do leaders balance that long-term complex need for systemic equity, which means changing policies, with the very immediate, almost primal need of residents to just feel safe walking down their street tonight? When those two goals get framed as opposites, as mutually exclusive, that's when you get the kind of civic turmoil we're seeing.
And, the struggle isn't unique to New York. Cities everywhere are grappling with legacies of injustice and how to reform. NYC is just a very visible, very high-stakes laboratory right now.
Which leads us right back to the core challenge highlighted in our source material. As New York continues to transform under all this pressure, what's the end game? Will the city manage to find that difficult but crucial balance between justice and safety? Where reforms actually fix systemic problems without making people feel unsafe day to day? Or will it become the next cautionary tale? Proof, maybe, that some radical policy ideas just don't mesh with the practicalities of running a large, complex city. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways from this deep dive for you, the listener. We talked about that significant shift in NYC's image, from resilience to this narrative, at least among some, of a city slipping into chaos. We saw how specific policies are at the absolute center of this debate. Bail reform, specifically eliminating cash bail for many nonviolent offenses, and that huge $1 billion cut to the NYPD's budget.
Right. And underpinning all of this policy debate is that really stark ideological divide. On one side, you have the push for truly radical reform, personified by figures like Zohran Mamdani, aiming for systemic fairness, even police abolition, driven by compassion. And on the other side, you have that sharp conservative critique, like Laura Ingraham's warnings, built on the fear that letting go of control inevitably means public disorder. Which leaves us, and you, with a really important question to think about. If the goal genuinely is both humanity and order, if we actually want both fairness in the justice system and for people to feel less afraid, how can a city bridge that gap? How do you connect the fight for that progressive ideal of systemic fairness with the need to address the very real, very immediate uncertainty and fear that ordinary people experience every single day? Finding that connection, that reconciliation, that seems to be the defining challenge for New York's path forward.